Chapter 16. Over the course of those 2 days, Hannah didn't speak a word unless instructed to do so by the tutor. She looked no one in the eye, and a smile rarely spread across her face. She could not even stand the look of her own reflection, which she had before found displeasing, but now discovered it to be repulsive. She despaired to find that her simple self could not adapt to this extravagant world. Her mother would always come in exhausted. Van, too, would remain silent. After that first day at the castle, he never left the room again, with the exception of meals, in part because their mother forced him. The prince stopped speaking to Hannah after her first few quietly mumbled responses, his face expressing his pity and shame. The entire castle seemed to be covered by a dark veil, one that seemed rather unfitting for the days leading up to the wedding. The only person who appeared to not lose step was the royal advisor. The royal advisor seemed to be relaxing, as if all of his plans had fallen into place and he was hoping no unaccounted-for variable would interfere. The wedding plans had been in the works for quite a while, long before the prince had chosen Hannah to be his queen. However, the long preparation made the days leading to the wedding no less stressful, the greatest stress to the royal advisor being Hannah. But Hannah admitted defeat. She did so on that night when she could no longer fight back, defy his control over the prince, over her future. She had lost the will to fight, her simple tactics standing no chance to his well-practiced strategies. Therefore, he could relax. He was no longer worried Hannah would mess with his plans, or, if she did, he was not concerned because he had developed countermeasures to ensure his victory. Hannah stood on a small stool in front of a large mirror. Several of the ladies-in-waiting ran around her, picking and poking and prodding in what Hannah deemed a futile attempt to make her beautiful. The dress fit amazingly, and Hannah felt vain as she examined herself in the mirror. More attention had been put into her appearance than had ever been. She held her arms stiff at her sides, her fingers anxiously stroking her palms. Her heart pounded, the sound of its beat the only noise that hadn't faded to the background. Because the dress was so form-fitting, Hannah found difficulty in breathing, though she knew once she was to sit the sensation would be much worse. Hannah's mother entered the room in a beautiful gown with a frantic expression. When her eyes fell upon Hannah, tears swelled within them. She ran to her daughter and embraced her. Holding Hannah's hands in her own, her mother's eyes looked her daughter up and down before connecting eyes with her. "You look stunning, Hannah, my Hannah," her mother whispered, the last words dissolving in her cry. Hannah felt the tears forming in her own eyes. She had dammed them up, but the barriers were beginning to break down, cracks spreading due to the stress. Multiple emotions swirled within Hannah, none of them joyous and none of them comforting. Anxiety, fear, numbness, grief, hopelessness. Hannah didn't know which emotion she'd want to be rid of most. As her mother cried, Hannah almost believed her mother's tears were derived from guilt, as if she could hear a whisper removed from time saying, "I'm so sorry." Hannah managed to hold back the tears, even managing to force a smile which had become easy after the practice with the tutor. "Thank you, Mother," Hannah responded, the conscripted, soothing lilt of her voice not deceiving her mother in the slightest. Hannah's eyes glanced up as she saw another enter the room, one she may have once been close to, but felt distant to anymore. Nina, in a gown more elegant than her own gown to the ball, sat in a seat, patiently awaiting the wedding. Hannah closed her eyes and took in as deep a breath as she could before releasing it. "How is Van?" "Oh, he looks so handsome. Oh, how I wish your father could be here to see the two of you. But his work, it was short notice," Hannah calmly stated, though thinking of her father only made the tears more forceful against the floodgates. "I'm sure he's more upset about missing this than we are of him not being able to make it." Her mother stared at the ground for a moment before nodding. "I'm certain you're right." The door opened and the entire room was shushed. A lady-in-waiting, one who was acting as a courier on this day, arrived with a message. She instructed them to take their positions as they had practiced the day before and wait for further instructions from those standing watch at the doors. "Good luck," Hannah's mother whispered to her, giving one last embrace and a kiss on the cheek before turning to leave. "I love you." Her mother walked out the door and into the great hall to take her seat. Hannah watched in agony as her mother took every step away from her. However, she was frozen in place. She could not follow. She could not shout, only watch as the floor between them crumbled. "I love you too," Hannah mumbled. The bridal party formed a single file line, Hannah at the back. Nina took her place directly in front of Hannah, still refusing to look Hannah in the eye. Hannah examined Nina's dress, happy to see it was tailored as lovely as her own. Some may be upset that their friend appeared more beautiful than oneself on their wedding day. However, Hannah felt relieved, as if this somehow made up for the differences between them, the conflicts holding them apart. Even if they could no longer be friends, Hannah simply wished for Nina to be happy, and she was sure Nina felt the same. Hannah tapped on Nina's shoulder. Nina slowly turned around to face her old friend. "You look beautiful," Hannah whispered to Nina, sharing a genuine smile. Nina's face appeared to soften. Nina swallowed and looked to the ground before meeting Hannah's eyes for a brief moment and saying, "You too." The line began to move forward, and Nina turned back to face the front. Hannah felt a flash of happiness, for hearing Nina's voice was enough reason to celebrate. However, the flash dissipated in an instant. As she walked through the door and followed the line down the hall and into the great hall, the butterflies took flight in Hannah's stomach. Though not as crowded as the night of the ball, the rows of chairs were filled with faces unfamiliar to Hannah. Many unique styles among them. Hannah figured they must be royalty from other lands. Perhaps the 4 other rulers on the United Court of Kings were in attendance. Hannah recognized the faces of her mother and brother staring back at her. Beyond their disguised expressions, Hannah saw eyes devoid of happiness and joy. Pity and preconceived grief were all Hannah could see. Before Hannah could sense any feeling, any grasp on the situation, she felt a gentle hand on her arm. She suddenly stopped and realized she would have walked into the pulpit had she continued. The prince, silently chuckling at what he presumed to be nerves, had stopped her. He lightly turned her to face him, his hand softly brushing down her arm until he held her hand in his own. His charming smile and his sparkling eyes caused Hannah to reach for breath her corset seemed to forbid. Her eyes rested in his and did not move. The words of the bishop were no more than an indistinct mumbling in the background as the ceremony moved forward. Hannah stood paralyzed. The prince ever so gently squeezing her hand every so often to ensure she was not on the verge of fainting. She'd slightly changed her facial expression to resemble a smile, though a partial grin was all that ever appeared. Her mind was in a flurry. This can't be it, Hannah thought, the environment completely fading away. It must be a dream. It must. A week before, she had never imagined how her life would change. No one could have predicted it. A simple girl like herself was not meant to be queen. Her job was at the bakery, her family's bakery. Perhaps she would wake up and find that she had zoned out as she normally did when business was slow. Maybe she had passed out. That night in the alley and every event after had been no more than fiction. Hexfer, Jasper, Seer. Were they all in her head? Their images flashed through her memory. The sorcerer cloaked in ruby with dazzling amber eyes staring back at her, his expression of joy transforming into sadness as he turned to walk away, fading in the distance. Hannah wanted to scream out, to stop him from going away, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, both in the physical world and within her mind. She thought the dream in her head had ended, unaware of the turn it was about to take. A shadow rapidly covered the sky, her entire surroundings lost to the blackness. All she could make out was a lamp, but it wouldn't light despite the darkness. It was broken. A figure darker than the shadows around it approached. It was robed in black, as if veiled in darkness himself. He carried a scythe, much like the depiction of reapers from earlier times. A fear struck Hannah. She felt a violent wind attempt to sweep her away, but her feet were rooted in place. She glanced up at the lamppost. It began to flicker with a calming red flame. Hannah returned to reality with the pressure of the prince's hand squeezing her own. She realized she had begun to fall over, the prince preventing her from doing so. His face continued to express happiness, but his eyes showed concern, the sparkle in them asking her if all was well. Hannah subtly nodded, despite her entire body quaking. She locked every part of her body, worried that if she didn't, she would collapse to the ground. The room seemed to be spinning, much like the twister of butterflies within her. Her eyes moved with the room. She saw the faces of her mother and Van, indistinguishable expressions on their faces. Then she saw the ladies in waiting, crying, whether in celebration of the marriage or out of self-pity for not marrying the prince themselves. Sitting adjacent to them was Nina, who stared at the ground. Next to her, and resting his hand on her knee, was the royal adviser, piercingly glaring at Hannah. Hannah felt a chill rise through her body, the butterflies doing their best to dodge the blizzard. Hannah felt sick. She tried to convince herself it was the excitement of the joyous occasion, but even her inner voice could not persuade her of it. The trick of forcing an emotion was convincing yourself that the forced emotion was what you truly felt. Hannah had much practice, and yet she no longer possessed the energy to do so. Her vision started to blur. The prince's warm hand held her, the only sensation keeping her from falling into darkness. In that instant, the horns rang out and the chorus sang, the composition of sounds beautiful to most ears, but no more than a frightening thunder to Hannah. Her eyes widened as she realized she had missed most of the ceremony, the crowning about to begin. 2 thrones were brought out by the servants and sat behind Hannah and the prince as they turned to face the middle aisle. Up the aisle strode the bearers, holding cushions upon which sat the crowns. The prince led Hannah to her throne and helped her to sit. She shared an anxious grin with him, expressing her gratitude. Once sitting, her nerves calmed, but the room continued to spin as breathing became harder to accomplish. The prince knelt before her. Hannah stared into his blue eyes, his soft yet strong features comforting her heart. The bearers stopped before them and bowed. They extended their arms. The prince took the crown from atop one of the cushions and raised it above Hannah's head. The bishop chanted a few words, which entered through Hannah's ear before immediately leaving, her not remembering a word of it. The prince dropped his arms, the weight of the crown touching upon her head. Hannah trembled, the cold metal pushing against her skull. However, a strange sensation coursed through her. She felt re-energized. A new power flowed through her, as if the crown itself gave rulers and leaders such authoritative properties. She was queen now. She could not change the events of the past, only look toward the future. The prince believed in her abilities to be queen, and now, with the crown atop her head, she will not disappoint him or the kingdom of Wyvernon. The prince grabbed her hand and kissed the top, a smile spreading on both of their faces. He sat on his throne, and the bishop walked around to the front. He rose a king's crown high above his head, as if proclaiming to the heavens, and, after a chant similar to the one for Hannah's crown, the bishop placed the crown on the head of the prince. The moment it rested upon his head, the prince transformed into a king. Though not a change of physical appearance, his entire manner seemed to resonate throughout the room, his magnificence and strength undeniable to all who laid their eyes on him. A resounding applause filled the great hall, the crowd standing and cheering in the name of Wyvernon. The hall was rearranged by the servants as a crowd stood in the center, their chairs being carried to the sides, the setup identical to the night of the ball. The king held Hannah's hand and led her to their seats. Her mother and Van joined at her side, her mother embracing her daughter, the queen. Hannah couldn't explain the feeling as she watched everyone sitting to eat with smiles on their faces, smiles derived from what they believed to be Wyvernon's good fortune and a bright outlook for the future, as if her being queen was a blessing. For once, Hannah didn't feel worthless or invisible, but confident and proud, for she would not bring her family's name shame, but rather honor. All in the room respected her. She could sense it, whether from the synergy of the room or her own fantasy. The high spirits around energized Hannah, and she felt utmost bliss. She forgot about all her worries and fears. The butterflies no longer stirred but danced. The simple girl no longer was simply existing. She was living. After the meal, the king and Hannah were the first to take the dance floor, as was tradition for wedding ceremonies. Later into the night, the band played the Dance of the Enchantress. As Hannah and the king danced with one another, gazing joyfully into the other's eyes, she couldn't help but feel something was missing. The blue eyes looking back at her lacked fire her own eyes were in search of. As the night went on, Hannah felt full of energy and life, as if a pressure had been lifted off of her. It was not until more of the guests left that she realized the cause. The royal advisor was nowhere in sight. His glare always hit her in a similar hostile manner as the look of Hexfer. Both of their presences were daunting and could fill her with the feeling of fear and despair. Hannah was not upset by the royal advisor's absence, for without his presence she was free to be happy. However, she wished she knew where he was. Simply not knowing stirred an anxiety within her, one that was not easily rid of for the rest of the night. Before the last of the guests left, the king led Hannah from the great hall and into the silence filling the rest of the castle. The quiet environment released a tranquility. Her excess energy and happiness slowly transformed. As they ascended the stairs, Hannah felt a rise of nerves and uneasiness. She wondered whether it be the butterflies ready to launch in her stomach, or if a stronger, ominous sensation shook her to her core. The calm before the storm. She attempted to shake the thought, but failed. The mystery of the royal advisor's location increased her sense of dread, and out of her peripheral vision, the shadows crept up on her. Every turn became an unnerving obstacle, every passageway a claustrophobic terror as the walls closed in on her. Hannah crumpled her dress in her fingers, the other hand steadily clutching the king's arm. Death's kiss would meet her that night. Her pessimism could not be shaken. They entered the king's bedchamber, illuminated with many candles, a silver tray of food and bottle of wine waiting on a finely set table. Her jaw dropped in awe of the sight, her heart shaking with a flurry of nerves. Passing the threshold into the room removed every bad thought as she entered a fantasy realm. Hannah trembled. She licked her lips, her hormones powering her new thoughts. The king smiled at her reaction and led her to the edge of the magnificently adorned bed, the vibrant colors of the soft cotton blankets and silk sheets showcasing the extravagance of royalty. Hannah's eyes roamed the room, which appeared larger than the inside of her house. A fireplace, much like the one her family had in the guest quarters, sat opposite of a large glass door leading out onto the balcony. Near the screen where she assumed he dressed, Hannah noticed a vanity 3 times the size of her own. The mirror shined in the light of the room, and Hannah could make out her own figure. She barely recognized herself in the beautiful gown, her hair twisted up with a crown upon her head. Yet the only fire in the reflection of her eyes resulted from the candlelight. The flames created many shadows, all of which consumed Hannah's energy and joy from earlier. The shadows about her eyes formed a gaunt face, her neck vanishing in the darkness. A disembodied head met her vision, one crying out for help. The king took up both of her hands, his warm, calming touch causing Hannah's head to jerk in his direction. Pulled from her dark thoughts, Hannah's heart accelerated in the moment her eyes met his. He gazed at her with an intensity so strong she believed it may be magic. The romantic setting with the charming king belonged in fairy tales, not for a simple, homely girl like her. Hannah could not foresee a happy ending. Her doubts and lack of self-esteem drained the thoughts of the bright future that many had seen for Wyvernon. Much of a stressful day has passed, and yet you appear more beautiful than at the beginning. Tell me how that is possible, my queen, the king asked in a quiet, whimsical tone. Hannah took his question as rhetorical, knowing her voice would crack if she were to speak. Rather, Hannah smiled, the king's expression mirroring her own. His hand rose up her arm. Hannah found difficulty in swallowing. With a relaxed jaw, Hannah closed her eyes in hope she'd fall further into the dream. We will be the greatest team the whole of Wyvernon has ever seen, the king chanted. Hannah delighted to know the royal advisor did not hear his statement, for it sounded like the king was replacing him with her. She could do nothing but smile in response. Hannah opened her eyes and noticed the king gazing at her form, his other hand moving to flatten the fabric on her thighs. The king released a breathy laugh, a sincere, nervous smile forming on his face. He raised his hand and gently brushed her cheek. Hannah's heart leapt. Wrapping his hand around the back of her head, the king pulled Hannah close to him. Their lips met, and Hannah knew not what to feel. Her heart raced as a flurry of nerves coursed through her body. The butterflies took off. She fell into the dream. Is this love? She wondered of the sensation, not recognizing the feelings filling her thoughts. As if overpowered by a magical spell, Hannah's lips met his with a passion she'd never known. When they pulled apart, the king peered into her eyes, his icy blue eyes piercing her heart in their charm. He brought his hands to her head and removed the crown, placing it on the bed beside them. "You don't need this piece of metal to be my queen," he said. He wrapped a hand about her back. With another, he drew her arm about him. He pulled her close. Before their lips met, he stopped to whisper, The door of the room swung open. The king and Hannah, startled by the sudden bang, wondered the cause. Hannah felt the pit in her stomach open, and not even the butterflies could escape from the gravity of its pool. The royal adviser stomped in, glaring at Hannah all the while. Beside him stood Nina, and behind them 3 castle guards. All but Nina appeared hostile as she stared at the ground in what Hannah thought to be sadness. But odder still was the fact that Nina wore naught but a silk and lace nightgown. "What is the meaning of this?" the king yelled, glaring in the direction of the unwelcomed party. The anger, accompanied by a slight embarrassment, was evident in his voice. "Your queen is not as lovely as you may believe, your majesty," the royal adviser stated in a harsh tone. Hannah felt the shadows creep in as she sat on the edge of the bed, paralyzed. "Explain yourself," the king ordered the royal adviser. The adviser's eyes glimmered with the fire of manipulation he loved to exercise on the king. Hannah, hoping his power would no longer work. "This girl lied before the royal court and, more ruthlessly, lied to you, your majesty." His voice rose in volume as he spoke, perhaps hoping others would be more convinced. Hannah prayed, crying out in her head that the lie would end. "She has communicated with sorcerers in an attempt to take over the kingdom of Wyvernon. Once queen, she was to assassinate and overthrow you, so the sorcerers may rise to power and no longer have you to fear." Hannah looked from face to face, the only ones looking at her doing so with a fierce hostility. Hannah knew she could not defend herself. The king stared at the royal adviser in shock, not knowing whether to believe it or not. Nina closed her eyes, head turned to the ground. "She needs to be locked up and further questioned in the attempt that we may find the other conspirators. And we will find them, at all costs." With this, the royal adviser's words sounded toxic and merciless. Hannah understood exactly what he meant. Execution. "Hannah, is this true?" the king asked, his eyes looking as if he'd been betrayed, but clouded over as if the tears didn't believe a word of it. The prince, now king, lacked the power to admit his adviser may be lying. He lacked the confidence to stand up for what he knew to be the honest truth. Hannah's mouth opened to respond, her head already shaking at the false claim. "Treason! Lying to the king when we know the truth. Guards, seize her." The 3 men rushed at Hannah. Hannah struggled in their arms, the despair from the nights before finding their way to her thoughts. She wrestled and fought their grip, but she was far weaker than the 3 of their combined strength. The king stood to try and stop their force, but the royal adviser intervened, placing himself between them. The guards began to carry her from the room, the royal adviser following, and the king watching in horror. "You can't do this," the king yelled at them, his call causing them to freeze. Hannah's eyes met his, both of them sharing in the panic, both of them begging to return to their privacy moments before. "You told me I could choose my queen, and I chose Hannah. Whether you disapproved of her or not should have been made clear before we wed. I believe I made myself very clear that I would not allow this criminal to be our queen. If Hannah says she did not do it, I believe her. She is the queen I chose. I have chosen you a new queen for the time being," the royal adviser stated, motioning to Nina. Hannah and the king turned to her. Tears flooded Hannah's eyes. She understood. Nina had known from day 1 at the castle why she was there. Nina knew she was to be queen at Hannah's expense, and yet did nothing to warn her friend. Her shame kept her silent, not even the guilt causing her to speak a word about what was to come. "This is unacceptable," the king screamed as he marched for the door. 2 castle guards who had not been seen prior stepped in front of the door, preventing the king's passage. "Move, I say! I am your king." "Unfortunately, you have spent time alone with Miss Baker, and we cannot prove you are not under a spell. Until we get that information from her, you will be restricted to your room," the royal adviser said. The authority of his voice almost sounded playful, as if he enjoyed the power he exercised. The 3 guards carried Hannah away, resisting her fight back. The royal adviser followed and called behind him, "This is for the well-being of Wyvernon, your majesty. I'm sure you'll understand." The 5 ascended a flight of stairs into a dark tower room.
Hannah squirmed, but their strength held her onto the chair as they tightened the rope around her. When she could no longer move her arms and legs, the guards and the royal advisor left her to the shadows. Hannah cried out in despair. Even though she believed no one heard her shouts, she was alone. Perhaps she had always been alone.